What about God's initiative? What about even God's predestination? God's will in advance to do what's necessary to bring salvation to His creation. I'm going to take you through these things one step at a time. This is in a lot of ways the doctrine of predestination or the doctrine of election is unhappy. I killed a couple of Bible studies as a younger Christian by bringing it up. And I've watched students, I've watched anxiety and distress grow in the faces of students as they encounter Christian doctrines of predestination and doctrines of election. So that's, that can't be said so much about the doctrine of sin that we just covered, or the doctrines of creation that we covered earlier. Those are happier doctrines. What's going on? What's going on with the doctrine of predestination? Well, in a way, to answer that question, we should go over the background of the doctrine. How does it develop? Where does it come from? I have a series of charts to use as backdrops, and they're not as complicated as they look. What they are trying to do is plot the interaction that we have with God as really all creation moves from its original goodness through the fall to salvation and perfection. If you look on each page, there's a left axis, and it starts at the bottom with creation and then the fall above it, and then 3 steps of salvation. And you're going to recognize this later in the semester when we talk about the order of salvation. Those are the 3 steps that we will explore. So we travel from the bottom to the top of the chart. And then along the bottom axis, on the left side, you have God taking the initiative apart from our willing it. On the right hand, you have us taking initiative apart from God willing it. And then in the middle, cooperation, where we fruitfully cooperate with God. This chart is just meant to give you a sense of the contrasts and also some of the similarity, because you're going to notice that some of these charts aren't all that different. In fact, the one that gets the most attention, the debate between Calvinists and Arminians, is actually the most similar. Those 2 curves are the most similar of any that you'll see. Augustine, over the course of the decades in which he had this debate with followers of Pelagius, was led during the course of that debate into a more and more strict doctrine of predestination, until he's really led logically to the conclusion that there was a kind of double predestination. God chooses certain people to receive His grace and be saved, and chooses other people not to receive His grace and not to be saved. That seemed to be the logical outcome of the priority of God's grace and the unevenness of grace's reception. And you'll see that later in Calvinism. Calvinism takes that thorough Augustinian position. I came upon something really kind of interesting in reading one of his works, Augustine's Enchiridion. He says that in the very beginning, the very, very beginning, God had created the world and the angels and all the rest, and in heaven there were a perfect number of worshipers. There were a perfect number of beings in communion with God and in right relationship with God. Now, Augustine is powerfully influenced by Platonism, which idealizes the spiritual. What happened? Well, there was this war in heaven where 1/3 of the angels are cast out. That war seems to be described in Revelation 12. We don't have time to go into the fact that in Revelation 12 it doesn't seem to be an event at the beginning of time. They're cast out of heaven by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of the testimony of His martyrs. So it seems to happen in the Christian era that war is won in heaven. Which kind of changes your timeline a little, doesn't it? But Augustine was reading with the great majority of Christians. He was reading that scene as not happening after Jesus' death, but happening at the very beginning of creation. There were a perfect number of beings in communion with God. A third of them leave. And now there's vacancies in heaven. Now there's not a perfect number of beings who are worshiping. What's God going to do about it? He creates humanity and appoints the number of human beings to be saved to make up for the vacancies in heaven, to restore heaven to its perfection. And that's where his imagination is shaped into a doctrine of the election of a specific number of saved people. Church councils like the Council of Ephesus and the Council of Orange rejected Pelagius' argument and affirmed the priority of grace. So you might say that the church rejected Pelagius without simply taking Augustine's side. It accepted a number of Augustine's points, but didn't accept the entire package of Augustinian teaching. And that Augustinian framework continues to characterize the Western Church really ever since. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas affirms the Augustinian priority of grace, affirms predestination, but works it into a Catholic sacramental framework. It sort of subordinates predestination to the Church's offer of grace to anyone. And God's predestination turns out to work out to those who receive Christ's grace sacramentally by believing, being baptized, and maintaining communion. Pelagius had stressed human effort, right, and human willing, and the sacramental system seemed to hinge on human willing as well. I mean, if I don't take communion, if I don't confess my sins, I'm not going to maintain that communion with God. And on the one hand, it utterly depends on God because it's grace that makes it all happen. But now it seems also to depend on me to cooperate. And since the church didn't do a hugely great job educating its people in the Middle Ages, you can imagine how people take that easily into a direction that relies on works, that relies on the things we do. The Reformation insisted that salvation is God's work first and last, and really all along. And so Luther affirms the Augustinian doctrine of predestination. Not really double predestination, but at least single predestination. God chooses who will hear and believe and be saved. And Calvin affirms the doctrine of election even more explicitly, teaching increasingly that double predestination that characterizes the end of Augustine's career. You might say that Thomas Aquinas and the Catholic tradition take on a soft Augustinian position, whereas the reformers like Luther and Calvin take a hard Augustinian position. Nobody's Pelagian, but there's a spectrum of positions within the Augustinian tradition that develops over the centuries. So Calvin teaches the sheer sovereignty of God and God's sovereign choice to save those whom God wills to be saved. So we can't work our way to salvation. And we can't even really work our way out of salvation because God's grace is powerful and God's faithfulness is vast. And God will outweigh our unbelief. So that's the 16th century Reformation. But it's not entirely convincing to all the Protestants in Europe. And a Dutch Reformed clergyman named James Arminius and those who follow him come around to being unhappy with several elements of Calvinist theology. And in what's called the Remonstrance of 1610, they develop 5 points where they are either unconvinced that Calvin's teaching is appropriate or they reject Calvin's teaching. First, predestination is conditional on a person's response, being grounded in God's foreknowledge. They were unhappy with the idea that God simply chooses. Romans 8:28 says, those whom God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son. So Arminians argue that God does choose those who will be saved, but what God chooses depends on God's foreknowledge of who will accept salvation. That takes a lot of the teeth out of the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. It makes predestination simply a function of foreknowledge. Number 2, Christ died for all, but only believers are saved. They didn't like the Calvinist notion that atonement applies only to those God has chosen. Jesus died for everyone. The scriptures seem to say so. Number 3, a person is unable to believe and needs the grace of God. That's a point of agreement. Both traditions agree that our wills are incapable of choosing or recognizing what's good. However, item number 4, this grace is resistible. This came up when Joshua saved my life a few days ago. If the next day I'm swimming back in the water out of my depth, literally, and I drown, it wasn't that you hadn't saved my life, it was just I refused to continue in that salvation. So grace is resistible. And their 5th objection to Calvinism is we might be able to lose our salvation, so to speak. Later Arminians conclude that yes, we can lose our salvation. Yes, we can fail to persevere. We can turn back after having first accepted Christ's grace and been saved, been regenerate. We can give up what we've been given. So those become the 5 points of the Remonstrance in 1610. And through John Wesley in the 18th century, this becomes a pretty common vision of Christianity among people who are called Arminians. Notice, Arminians are not the same as Armenians. Armenians come from Armenia. Arminians are followers of James Arminius. I'm sure that there are Armenians who are Arminians, but that's just a coincidence. 9 years later, the Belgian Reformed Church in 1619 met at the Synod of Dort, or Dordrecht. That's the full name of the assembly of the town. They met and reaffirmed all 5 claims of Calvinism over against Arminianism in no uncertain terms, like with a bazooka. And what they claimed are what some of you know as the 5 points of Calvinism. They reaffirmed total depravity. In other words, we're unable to believe and we radically need the grace of God. They put it, though, even more dramatically. Total depravity means nothing that I do, nothing that I think or say is untouched by sin. Everything is compromised. So apart from God's grace, nothing I can do or believe or think will be adequate in God's sight. Secondly, unconditional election. Those whom God chooses to be saved, God simply chooses out of God's own sovereign will. Why do they do that? Really to honor the sovereignty and the lordship of God. The Arminians were unhappy with the moral implication that God would choose some to be saved but not others, because it seemed unjust. Let God be just. And the Calvinist response at the Synod of Dort and later was, let God be God. It's not unfair if God chooses, because what God chooses is good. God does not submit to some higher moral standard. God is the standard of goodness. The 3rd point is limited atonement. And we'll say more about this later when we're talking about atonement, when we're talking about how the cross works. But Christ died only for the elect. In his death, he is a substitute only for those God chose to be saved. After all, if he's the substitute for those God chose not to be saved, how could they not be saved? If Christ has atoned for their sins, what can keep them out of communion with God? So atonement is limited to the elect. The 4th point, irresistible grace. God's grace is so attractive, so good, so healing, that it wins us over. Maybe not immediately, but we simply will not continue to resist forever as God's grace works in us to will properly, to work properly. As God remakes our desires, will come around. I mean, think of your dream date, whoever that is. Would you honestly say no? And the 5th point is perseverance of the saints. Or you could put it baldly as once saved, always saved. Those God has chosen to be saved, God will not lose. They can struggle and tug and run, but like lost sheep, they'll be found and they'll be recovered and brought back to the fold. Jesus' parable of the lost sheep or the lost coin indicates that he's not a God who will just take 99% and say, well, that's good enough. He's going to find his own. Those come to be known as the 5 points of Calvinism. Now note, John Calvin said a lot more than just these 5 things. In fact, John Calvin's writing 70 years earlier. Calvinism is a much broader framework. It's not just about predestination. If you read the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is John Calvin's systematic theology, it pertains to all kinds of things. And if there's an overriding category, it's not predestination or election. You could call it covenant, or you could call it worship, or God's glory. Those seem to be the overriding themes of his theological vision. Whereas the controversy surrounds these 5 points, and so Calvinism comes to be used to refer only to these 5 points, and only to the points as they're laid out even more rigorously 70 years later. All right? So I'll refer to Calvinism here, but by that I really mean tulipism. I mean the narrower school of thought in the controversy with Arminians. The English-speaking Protestant world inherits a number of different currents. It inherits the Catholic notions through the Church of England, which has a Catholic side, as well as a Reformed side, as well as a Lutheran side, as well as a Wesleyan side. It's kind of a mishmash. They call it the via media, so I shouldn't call it a mishmash. It's a middle way. It's kind of a big umbrella. And Lutheran tendencies are powerful both in the Church of England, which becomes the Episcopal Church and the Episcopal family of churches in America, and they're influential through migrations of Lutherans from Germany and Scandinavia and a number of other places. And those 5 Calvinist points, those are more Calvin's vision than Luther's vision. Luther doesn't put things that way. And Calvinism is strong, especially in the Puritans, right? The Puritans are pretty strict Calvinists. And Arminianism is very influential, especially through the Wesleyan tradition, through John Wesley, who was horrified by the Calvinist doctrine of election. English-speaking Protestantism inherits from all of them. Evangelicalism absorbs these and more. And a lot of you raised your hands because you don't fit in either of those categories. And I'm curious where you resonate. Was it back with Pelagius and an emphasis on freedom and initiative? Actually, I think a lot of people grow up thinking just that. A lot of our churches are full of people who don't know that Pelagius was condemned and don't see anything wrong with treating us as having to make the first move. They're not even Arminian.